Okay, so we go from miracles to paradoxes. That's our theme for March. Living with paradox. Everybody knows what a paradox is, right? No, wait a second. Wait a second. No, that's a pair of docks out in the water. No, we mean this one. No, that's a pair of docks. Docks. No, I mean paradox. Paradox. Like that's a pair of ducks. But did you notice what they're doing? They're line dancing, aren't they? Line dancing ducks, that is a paradox. But anyway, no, what we're talking about, the paradox, seriously now, folks, a paradox is an apparently true statement or group of statements that seems to lead to a contradiction. The Greeks loved this stuff. I mean, from the moment they invented philosophy, the guys in the togas would sit around and argue about this stuff over and over and over again. In fact, the most famous paradox there is called the liar's paradox. And it's real simple. It goes like this. This sentence is false. Try to wrap your brain around that one for a moment, okay? Think about it. Try to use your intuition or analysis either way. If that is really false, then it must be true, right? But if it's true, then how can it be false? And you just get tangled up and you go round and around and around in circles. Now, of course, it doesn't just have to be statements, though, that create these paradoxes. Images can do it, too. Everybody knows how many legs an elephant has, right? Count the legs on the elephant. Go from the front to the back to the front. It ain't working, is it? That's a multi-legged elephant, and yet, it messes with your mind, right? or how about the drawings of M.C. Escher? You familiar with his stuff? He's famous for doing these crazy things like these staircases that go every which direction, people walking out of doors in the walls and things like that. Something that's impossible, but there it is. It's a paradox. And, these things are fun to look at, fun to think about. We laugh and we say, gee whiz, and things like that. But what about some of the paradoxical puzzles that are handed to us by the great spiritual traditions of the world? We human beings, we like to have things neat and tidy and orderly and logical. And when we run into spiritual teachings that seem to cause contradictions, sometimes we have a problem with that. Buddhism in particular is filled with paradox. In Zen Buddhism in particular, they use these things called koans. They're stories that lead you to a paradox. And a teacher uses the stories to try to get the student to go beyond the limits of superficial logic, to get to the deeper meaning of what the idea is, even beyond the words. And they're not afraid of paradox. And in fact, what they find is when the students work with these koans, these seeming paradoxes, that often what they find is they're not contradictory at all. But it takes work. It takes a willingness to go deeply. And for people who have to have things black and white, they run into a paradox and they turn it off. That's it. They don't want to go any further. When actually, if you just delve into it a little bit deeper, there's something meaningful there. There's a nugget of truth behind it. So today we're going to look at a paradox that arises from the core teaching in Buddhism that's known as the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths came about after the historical Buddha had been working for years trying all sorts of different kinds of spiritual practices to help him to find a way to eliminate suffering in the world. That's what he wanted to do, was to eliminate suffering. But everything he tried led to a dead end. When he was born, he was a prince, and he lived the life of a prince. Every luxury that he wanted, he was sheltered from the world. But inevitably, he had to go out into the world, and as soon as he left the walls of the palace, there he had to confront people who were hungry, people who were sick, people who were growing old, and people who were dying. He ran into suffering. Hiding in his castle didn't work. Bathing himself in luxury didn't work. He still ran into suffering, and it bothered him. So he tried the opposite approach. Gave it all up. Gave up all forms of luxury, gave up all forms of pleasure, things like even sleep and food he gave up, and that didn't work either. In fact, it almost killed him. What he learned was living at the extremes didn't reduce suffering. So he decided to try a more balanced approach, what they call the middle way. Not too much indulgence and not too much deprivation. And it turned out to be a great idea. Once he started living that way, once he started meditating and living the middle way, it brought him to this great insight that we call the Four Noble Truths. And the first one is that life inevitably brings suffering. Try as we might, we can't avoid it. Regardless of our wealth, our social status, our physical stature, everyone, everywhere, at some time or another, is going to experience grief, sickness, pain, loss. And the Buddha said that accepting this as truth is the first step towards reducing or perhaps even eliminating suffering. I'd settle just for reducing some of it at this point, wouldn't you? Well, the next truth tells us that real suffering is caused by clinging to that which is impermanent. And of course we know that everything that we run into in this realm is impermanent. It's going to change. And we go about our lives so often acting as if things never change. And then we're in this constant state of trying to chase after the things we think are going to bring us happiness, trying to run away from the things that bring us discomfort. And all we do is we create all this stress and anxiety, which only makes things worse. So the Buddha follows this up with the third noble truth. He says freedom from suffering comes from freeing ourselves from clinging and attachment. Call it non-attachment or call it detachment. Freeing ourselves from clinging. And then the fourth noble truth goes on to talk about something called the Noble Eightfold Path, which we don't need to get in here today. But he's talking about this idea of non-attachment. What does that look like? What would it look like to be completely free from clinging and attachment? To be detached? Would we be cold, aloof, unemotional, withdrawn from the world? Kind of like, maybe a Vulcan? Any Star Trek fans here? Anybody remember Mr. Spock? He used to drive Dr. McCoy crazy because he was so logical, so detached, and so unemotional. And if that's what detachment looks like, then we got a little bit of a problem here, because another one of the major core values of Buddhism is compassion. That's another one of the big teachings of the Buddha. They call it karuna, or metta, which is loving kindness, compassion. It's a core idea. So how can you be compassionate and detached at the same time? In fact, this whole idea of going off to a monastery or a temple away from the rest of the world seems like just the opposite of compassion. How can you help